A great welcome to you all. My name is Jacek Jasieniak. I'm the chair of the Energy Institute's Council for Australia, or ERICA, and I'm a professor at Monash University who is focused on new energy materials and technologies to enable a sustainable energy future. It's really an absolute pleasure to have you all join here today for the inaugural State of Energy Research webinar. Last year, we actually had our State of Energy Research Conference, which this year we obviously couldn't have for many reasons, mainly COVID-19. So we are pivoting to a new format to share our research findings and our researcher insights. Now, before we jump into our main speakers of the day, let me start by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nation, on whose land we are gathered here, particularly those in Australia are gathered here today. I pay my respect to their elders past and present. Now, I would also like to sincerely acknowledge the Monash Energy Institute for hosting today's webinar, and in particular, Shrijan Pandey, Nancy Van Nieuwenhove, and Mara Jorgovic for their help. Now, let me start by just introducing ERICA a little bit. ERICA was founded in 2017 through several academic organisations that included Monash University, ANU, University of Melbourne, University of Sydney, UNSW, University of Technology Sydney, Deakin, University of Queensland, Victoria University, Curtin University, and the University of Tasmania. Now, our goal coming together was really to provide research-led advice to support Australia's energy future. And as part of that mandate, it was to showcase our research capacity, provide policy advice, and also to provide perspectives on opportunities and challenges where research can actually assist in formulating a future. So, going back to the 2020 year, our goal was to have another State of Energy conference where we would bring leading Australian researchers and industry professionals together. But again, 2020 has been a very challenging year for us all. And so this webinar series is really a reflection of the fact that we need to change, we need to pivot. Our way to communicate will actually be more diverse and mobile. And so this format here is a really exciting and an opportunity for us to reach a greater and more diverse audience. So today is really about reflecting on that impact of COVID-19, not only by changing our format of delivery, but also on what has been the impact of COVID-19 on the energy system. So in today's inaugural State of Energy webinar, it's with great pleasure that we have three leading researchers and industry professionals to address and help to provide some insights on what has actually been the impact of COVID-19 here. Now, the speakers today will be Nicola Falcon, Rob Hyndman, and Frank Jotzo, who I will introduce in the coming moments. Now, the webinar will provide each of these speakers with about 12 minutes or so. If you have any questions, and I encourage you to write as many questions for the speakers as possible, there is a Q&A box there down below on your screen, so type them in, and at the end, I will divert them as appropriate. So on that note, let me introduce our first speaker, Nicola Falcon, who's the General Manager of Forecasting at AEMO. In that role, she's responsible for demand and supply forecasting of both electricity and gas in the NEM. She has over 20 years of experience in the energy sector and across markets and systems. So on that note, over to you, Nicola. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jack. Okay, we've got that up. Terrific. So yes, in my 12 minutes, I really just want to give you a little bit of a highlight. Let me just see if this is moving on. There we go. A little bit of a highlight of our quarterly energy dynamics report that we put out for Q3 this year, where we've discussed a little bit about our observed impacts of COVID-19 on the energy systems, both gas and electricity, and across both the NEM and WA. And then also talk really briefly about what the implications are for the energy system. And I should say, in terms of needing to change and pivot, certainly the industry and my team in forecasting have had to do that this year when all of the data and the models that we've trained on suddenly have been needing to be thrown out the window, and we need to think again about just what this impact of COVID on the energy system would be. So it's been a year of challenges for all of us. So the quarterly 3 report really focused on comparing what we're observing in demand this quarter from July to September against what we observed in 2019. Now, if you just looked simply at the operational demand in the NEM for now, between 2019 and 2020, you'd see that the operational demand is down about 1.4%. Now, operational demand is really the demand demand for supply from the grid. So what's masked in those numbers is any increase in rooftop PV that we might have seen from last year to next year. So the question is the reduction in demand that we're seeing of 1.4% due to COVID, or is it due to rooftop PV installations, or is it actually due to a combination of both? And while we have assessed that the majority of the reduction in demand across the NEM in general is due to continued growth in rooftop PV, we are seeing that there is still some impact, albeit more minor and more modest, from COVID. What we are seeing though is it's really influencing the demand shape. So we're seeing that there is a much reduced morning peak, particularly between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. Probably because many of us aren't needing to get up quite so early to commute into work, but we're working from home. Kids are not needing to necessarily get up earlier to get themselves ready for school and so forth. So we're seeing a reduction in that morning peak. But we're also then seeing an increase during the daytime. Again, as more of us are at home, needing to use power for any number of things, from computers and appliances through to heating. And then we're also seeing that is pushing into also an evening peak that is slightly higher than what we'd observed before. Now, if you actually zoom in a little bit and have a look on a regional basis, there are quite a few variations regionally. And that's probably not surprising to many of you. I mean, obviously the nature of the restrictions have been quite different between regions. Those of us here in Melbourne, myself included, have really enjoyed the first day of freedom for quite some time. But it also, the impact is going to depend on the proportion or the composition of the load in each region. So how much is residential, how much is commercial? Climate also makes a difference, and particularly things like heating demand and so forth, and the types of appliances that people have in their homes, and whether there's gas reticulation and so forth also will impact on the impact of COVID. So if we looked at it on a state-by-state basis, then we're seeing, compared to Q3 of 2019, and if we strip out the impacts of increased solar PV to look really at underlying demand, we're seeing that there's about a 90 megawatt lower average underlying demand in Victoria, 52 megawatt lower in Queensland, 14 in New South Wales, but we're actually seeing higher average demand in South Australia and also in Tasmania. In WA, while we saw a big initial change, it is now relatively unchanged in WA. But what's really interesting, if we unpack Victoria even a little bit further, is that we're seeing less commercial load. Obviously, as a number of businesses have been shut for a period of time, or we've been in a stage 4 lockdown. And then we're also seeing increases in residential demand. But whether the increase in residential demand completely offsets the reduction in commercial really has depended on the season and also on the temperatures. So in the cold winter days of July, we actually saw that there was quite a significant increase in residential consumption, about 10 to 15% increase. And that more than offset the reduction in commercial demand that we'd been observing, which was also about a 15% reduction. But then as we've moved in towards September, where we actually had milder weather conditions, we actually saw then that the residential consumption has not been significantly, the increase in residential consumption has not significantly offset the commercial. And so therefore we've actually seen a net reduction in consumption in Victoria in August and September. The other interesting thing is that when we are working from home and schooling at home, residents tend to be a little bit more sensitive to temperature, and the demand seems to be more sensitive to temperatures. So the bottom plot here is where we've just sort of taken 2 o'clock in the afternoon periods of like conditions during the pandemic, and we've compared that to pre-pandemic conditions. And we can see that when we got really cold temperatures, the average underlying demand during the pandemic was definitely higher than pre-pandemic. But when there were milder conditions, it actually flipped the other way, and so we didn't see greater demand during the pandemic. And what this is doing is actually creating a much broader distribution of what the potential demand could be. Gas is actually showing similar sensitivity to impact of COVID during particularly cold weather periods. So we're starting to see that the morning peak starts later and stays higher during the day, in particularly the cold weather periods in Victoria, and it's slightly lower overnight as well, as you can see in this chart here. Now, what's not slowing down or changing, but it's just as interesting, is the impact that solar PV installations and people's desire to purchase and install solar PV has been. So when we first faced the pandemic, we were speculating that with the economic conditions and potentially people on the job seeker and the job keeper and so forth, we might start seeing a slowdown in sales, and certainly initial figures indicated that that was going to be the case. But as the CR indicated in their quarterly carbon report, we're actually seeing and on track to deliver record installations this 2020. The CR has speculated it could be a number of reasons, including the low interest rates. But I think there's also a sense of people starting to get the bill shock, realising that they're spending more time on energy and at home, and that's one way they could actually control some of their costs and their bill shock is to install PV. And there's a lot of home improvements going on at the moment as well. So just very briefly, what are the implications for the Australian energy system of these changes in demand, and particularly the changes in demand profile? Well, first and foremost, we needed to make sure our control room operators were safe. And so many of us have been working from home since March this year, so that we can stay well away out of the offices and leave our control room operators to do their most important tasks. And we're also needing to change the configuration of the control room to make sure that we're satisfying those safe distance requirements and shift numbers and so forth. What we've also done is work very closely with industry and generators in particular to better understand the impacts that COVID might be having on their workforces and their ability to maintain their equipment and their plant, and particularly helping with coordination of the maintenance. What we've noticed is that, particularly with concerns around the ability to mobilise workforces quickly if need be to repair generators if they trip, for example, a number of changes have been made to the types of maintenance that are being scheduled and the duration of the maintenance. So there's definitely been a trend towards shorter maintenance periods rather than planning any very big, large overhauls. What that will mean in terms of reliability this summer, we're yet to find out. The record sales of rooftop PV is also bringing down minimum demand and creating some system security challenges that we're needing to get on top of and manage quite quickly. The weekend, mid-October, 10th and 11th of October, we actually saw record all-time minimum demands in South Australia of about 300 megawatts, and that was really due to the growth in PV, but also there was some industrial load that was at lower than normal operation at that time. But we're also seeing Victorian operational demand hitting all-time records of 3 gigawatts in that same weekend. And in total, the NEM in that same weekend also experienced a record all-time daily minimum. So if that does create concerns around voltages and system strength and inertia that we're continuing to monitor and build an evidence base to understand. There's some work in the 2020 Electricity Statement of Opportunities that we published, if you're interested in understanding that a little bit more. And we'll also be putting out system strength and inertia reports at the end of the year, continuing to look at the impacts of minimum demand. Just a couple more things around the COVID. It's also creating a lot more forecast uncertainty. And while we can look at the observations we now have for quarter 2 and quarter 3 to try and predict what might be happening in the future, things as we start getting out of lockdown and we're working from home and having heating and cooling in both homes as well as offices, it's very uncertain what that's going to do to demand and whether the temperature sensitivity that we observed in winter is going to continue into summer. Now, some might speculate and say, well, yes, if we're going to use air conditioning at homes in summer at the same time as we're using air conditioning at works, then we're going to expect to see higher demands than what we would otherwise have predicted. A counter argument to that, or some more uncertainty, could be, well, during January, we're often already co-locating with some of us working from home and school, holidays and so forth in offices. So is it really going to be that much of a difference to what we would normally see? So there's a great range of uncertainty around what the maximum demand and therefore what the implications from a reliability perspective could be. And then longer term, again, what is going to be the economic impact? Are we going to see a Nike type recovery? Are we going to see a U-shaped type recovery? How quickly will we be able to rebound? What will be the trend and long-term implications in terms of demand? And what will happen with PV is this record sales that we're seeing a very reactionary response to the bill shock and the working from home, or is this going to just continue to be a trend that we see at the new rate of installations? So all of these are creating a lot more uncertainty. And then finally, on the gas demand side, with the shorter but higher demands during the day, what we're actually finding is that there have been a number of days this quarter where under forecasting of demand has led to us needing to issue notices of threats of system security for the Victorian declared wholesale gas market, which is really the main system in Victoria. And in those times, what we've needed to do is actually use additional operational or market measures, such as using the Dandenong LNG facility to be able to increase demand during the daytime and avoid those systems of threat to system security. So all in all, what we're needing to do with COVID is continue to really monitor the changing demand. We can't rely on a lot of years of history like we did in the past. This future is also going to be different to what we've observed in the last couple of months. So really the key thing for us is to continue to monitoring the changing demand profile and the forecast, and we continue also to work with industry to learn from and also help share the learnings as we go. So we continue to watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Fascinating to see that, I mean, there are differences obviously in the use profiles for residential and commercial users, but the fact that the solar cell panel increase sales is somehow related, that's pretty interesting. And I guess in some ways we need to address those energy system security issues that you outlined, because that's becoming more pervasive. Not to mention that question that you posed around what does post-COVID-19 look like in that recovery period? I think all fascinating questions to further comment on. So thank you very much, Nicola.
You're welcome.
Our next speaker is Rob Hyndman. He's professor and head of the Department of Econometrics and Business Statistics here at Monash University. Rob has published over 200 papers and 5 books on statistical science, and was the 2007 recipient of the Moran Medal from the Australian Academy of Sciences for his contributions to statistical research, particularly around forecasting. He's also worked heavily with AEMO on their forecasting models in the past, so he's an expert in this area. So without further ado, let me welcome you to Rob Hyndman.
Thanks, Jack, and it's great to be part of this. I'm going to be a little different from the others in that I haven't actually been doing any electricity forecasting myself in the last 9 months. I've been focusing on forecasting COVID-19 cases for the National Cabinet and for all the state health chief health officers. And I've been forecasting tourist numbers for Australia for the next 5 years in the context of COVID-19, which, as you can imagine, the impact of COVID-19 on tourism has been even greater than its impact on energy. But what I want to talk about is a data competition that I'm involved with, which does involve energy demand and COVID-19. So this is part of the Data Science Melbourne meetup group, and they have an annual, or sometimes more than annual, Datathon. The 2020 version is the 6th competition that's been run. And it's quite significant because Melbourne has one of the largest groups of data scientists in the world with over 13,000 members. It's a very active group with lots of events. The events, of course, are currently online. And as the number of data science graduates is increasing, getting a full-time position or internship is becoming increasingly tough. And it's hard also for recruiting companies to discover the most suitable candidates based only on a CV. So datathons have become one way for companies to distinguish between potential applicants. And the Melbourne Datathon is the local version of that to help local people demonstrate their skills. And this year, the challenge is on, can electricity consumption patterns tell us anything about the pandemic? If I just show you the website, this is the Melbourne Datathon website, and it tells you a little bit about the background. And the challenge is, can you analyse some electricity consumption data and determine if a change can be detected that may be attributable to COVID-19? And it was up to the participants to source their own data. And then they had to write a report and or develop an app to demonstrate what's going on. So my involvement, if you scroll down the website, all the way down to the bottom, is there that I'm one of the judges of the first half of that competition, along with Phil Briley. And the other half of the competition around the app is these two people at the bottom. So here is the challenge. I had to analyse some electricity consumption data and determine if a change can be detected due to COVID-19. Teams involved could be between 1 to 3 people. They didn't have to be students. They didn't have to be looking for a job. It could be anyone, anywhere, not just for Melbourne. And the category that I'm judging is where they had to produce a report. And importantly, it had to be reproducible. They had to have code to be able to reproduce the analysis that they did. They had to source their own data, and that was sort of an interesting part, is can people find appropriate data to use? And for people that hadn't previously looked at energy consumption or other energy data, we gave them a clue about possibly fitting a prediction model and then look to see how well it's done in 2020. So we have 29 entries. The competition has closed, but we haven't yet announced the winners, and I can't do so today, although I have looked at all of the entries. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about the sort of entries we got and highlight some of the things that they uncovered. The sort of data sets that the participants used were these ones, importantly AEMO data. And let me just say, AEMO does a wonderful job in providing free data to the research community. So much so that researchers all over the world frequently use Australian data when they're demonstrating their new methods in energy analysis, simply because the Australian data is so widely available and easy to use. And that's a great resource for the energy community and encourages research that's directly relevant to the Australian environment. If any organisation wants to get researchers involved but doesn't have the money to pay the researchers, just give away free data and people will come and do things. So they used the NEM data, they used some meter data. Some people used their own smart meter data. They used Bureau of Meteorology data and some various economic data from either the Victorian Department of Treasury and Finance or from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Some people used data from the Australian PV Institute, and then there was various sort of specific data sets around COVID-19 restrictions and numbers of cases that were used. all of which was freely available. They had to use data that was public. So I'm just going to show you a few graphs of the sort of things that people put in their reports. I'm not going to say who they are because I'm not commenting on who won, but obviously I've chosen graphs from the better of the reports. So this person looked at energy demand, looked at load profiles of energy demand before COVID-19. So they were taking data from 2016 to 2019 on the left, and on the right is data from 2020. So summer's missing here. This is just for Victoria. We haven't yet seen the summer, so it's you doing it in 3-month blocks and simply averaging the demand across the year without taking into account temperatures or other potential predictors. And sort of highlight some of the things that that Nicola mentioned, in that you've got this sort of increase in the evening peak happening. Obviously, we have different profiles in different seasons. In this data set, there was a drop in usage in the middle of the day, and either a very small decrease or no change in the morning for the data set that this person used. Then they looked at demand on weekdays and weekends, the same sort of thing, and notice the increasing size of the peaks relative to the troughs. This was from another report. This was looking at sort of the relative change in demand in 2020 versus 2017 to 2019 for different states. And this particular entry sort of found that there was these increasing peaks in Victoria and New South Wales in particular, and also in South Australia in the later part of the year, not so much in summer. Smaller changes in the morning peaks, and so that was an interesting analysis, I thought. And then the last one I wanted to show was this one from a third person's entry, or a third team's entry, and they were looking at differences in peak sizes. They took the evening peaks and they compared them to morning peaks, and so they aggregated data across sort of evening by taking some of the hours and calling that evening, and aggregated data for the morning. So the orange is the evening peak and the blue here is the morning peaks. I took the difference between the peaks and they've plotted this in blue. And then they built quite a sophisticated statistical model to test how much the difference had changed, taking into account things like temperature and humidity and other public holiday effects and calendar effects and so on, and found that the increase, which you can see at the end here, that there's a larger difference between the peaks in 2020 than you see in the other years. In fact, you tend to get a decrease in summer in the other years, and we're not yet seeing that in 2020. They also found that there was a big difference in April after the stage 3 restrictions were introduced. Okay, so that's a bit of a summary of what's happening in the data science competition that's going on at the moment. As I said, the entries have closed, but the results haven't yet been announced because the second half of the competition is still running, the app part of the competition. But it's good to see lots of students, mostly students, competing like this and doing some innovative analysis and demonstrating their skills on energy data. And hopefully some of the energy companies might pick up some of these great young data scientists who are learning how to analyze data like this. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. There's a good plug there for AEMO and how through their data management, they're actually helping to transform the global energy community. That's a note that I made. And just to touch base on that point around students, and there's a broader opportunity here, which is around that open challenge approach, which is throw the problem out and let's see what comes back. And I think you're going to get some pretty interesting results because there's a lot of talented people out there. So thank you very much for sharing those outcomes of the competition, and I'm sure they'll spark a few questions going forward. Thanks very much. Now, our final speaker for today will be Frank Jotzo. Frank is Professor and Director of the Centre for Climate and Energy Policy at the Australian National University. He is an environmental economist and does research on policy for climate change and energy. in the context of economic reform and development. He's also the Joint Editor-in-Chief of the journal Climate Policy. Thanks very much, Frank.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much, Jack. And just to say, great initiative actually to have these webinars. And I hope that perhaps they can be retained at the time when we're going back to having physical conferences as well. So what I'm presenting is joint work here with my colleague Mosmi Prasad here at the ANU. It's a paper that we're hoping to release quite soon in a working paper version. So look, I mean, globally, we've seen the COVID lockdowns have quite significant impacts on energy use and hence, of course, greenhouse gas emissions as well. This is taken from an attempt to estimate this globally that appeared in Nature Climate Change in May. In a nutshell, big reductions observed in power and industry, very large reductions observed in transport, and slight increases in many countries observed in residential energy use. The IEA has some really quite nice tracking of electricity sector consumption just there on their ongoing updated COVID report that shows you that kind of dip, in particular in the second quarter of this year. But what about Australia? So just to remind ourselves some background stats, the only point I want to drive home from this is that electricity and transport combined account for roughly half of domestic primary energy use and roughly half of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions inventory as well. And so our analysis focuses exclusively on electricity supply and transport fuels. Now, some of this material Nicola has already covered. Just to remind ourselves, a small reduction overall so far this calendar year in electricity use. Almost all of that reduction actually occurred in March, April. And a very diversified pattern of the changes in electricity use across states, with the southern states in particular experiencing increases during the various phases of COVID lockdown, and the other states tending to experience decreases. And so, I mean, if you speculate, then perhaps heating needs may have a fair bit to do with that. And of course, the net effect overall very small. I'll skip over the daily demand profiles. Other speakers have covered that in detail, other than to say, this is some data kindly provided by Evo Energy, the local energy distributor here in the ACT, courtesy Dr. Maurits Evers. So this is the ANU electricity usage, okay? And so what we see here is in 2020, a very sudden drop in electricity use at the ANU as the campus lockdown came into effect. Showing here data up until the end of April. We're no longer locked down, obviously. But actually what's remarkable to me is just how large the kind of, the continuing electricity consumption is on campus here, and just how small the actual reductions were that occurred as a result of people not being on campus. Perhaps some unused potential there in terms of turning things off. Now, in terms of overall change in the electricity sector, the ongoing addition of renewable energy generation sources completely dwarfs the COVID effect, okay? And so what we've seen over the course of the year is significant additions of wind and solar, right? That translate into significant reductions in coal-fired electricity, as well as, interestingly, gas-fired electricity, okay? So we've got this displacement effect going on, and that's the major driver of changes in greenhouse gas emissions. So in 2020, NEM-wide, so far this year, we've seen an approximately 5% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions relative to the same period last year. Of this, about 1/5 is due to the lower demand, the rest due to essentially coal to renewables and some gas to renewables substitution. And so that continues a long-standing trend of declining NEM greenhouse gas emissions. And that, interestingly, despite substantially lower wholesale prices for electricity this year, which is largely a corollary of lower gas prices in the market. Okay, so there's a very solid trend that we're observing here in lower NEM electricity sector emissions. Moving on to transport fuels. So we see replicated in Australia what we've seen in much of the rest of the world. Very substantial reductions in aviation, obviously. So the numbers just released up to August suggest that the effect is around 50% reduction for domestic aviation fuels and around just on 80% reduction in international aviation fuel sales. In terms of surface transport, the big reductions are in petrol, which is largely for private transport. Much smaller reductions can be seen in diesel fuels, which are of course largely for commercial transport. Now, in terms of emissions, we've seen really sizable reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the transport sector, around about 12% in 2020 compared to 2019 so far this year. And when I say so far, that's until the end of September. Overall effects and outlook, the emissions in electricity transport combined have been reduced by about 8% in 2020 so far. We would expect that effect to be somewhat lower over the full duration of the calendar year, right? Because the largest effects were, of course, during the early phases of the national lockdown in the second quarter. There's not really a reason to assume big COVID-related changes in other energy uses. The outlook, of course, is for electricity demand to remain flat pretty much and for decarbonization to continue for a very long time indeed. The outlook is also for transport really to gradually bounce back to pre-COVID levels, perhaps not quite the same for aviation, but certainly no major change in the composition or the efficiency levels of transport on the cards. And so overall, the lasting effects of the COVID lockdowns on Australia's emissions balance are probably going to be very minor indeed, and the large changes will be driven by that fossil fuel to renewable shift. So some broader perspectives, and I'd like to end on that. And so the question really is, so with this massive crisis that we've had on our hands, are we missing an opportunity here to use that to accelerate the transition that's coming in energy supply and in the transport sector as well? My view, right, we should really be talking about a renewables-led recovery rather than a gas-led recovery. That would be the more forward-looking perspective on things. Look to Europe, massive program here on public infrastructure spending, in a sense also industry policy spending, really build not just billions, but tens of billions into new energy technologies. China, Japan, possibly the United States with net zero emissions commitments for the middle of the century. And just to finish off with sharing the view that big areas of change in Australia's energy sector will continue to be the transition from coal-fired power to renewables, and that transition possibly actually gaining in speed and thereby throwing up all manner of questions about how to manage that transition for positive economic, regional and social outcomes. And of course also the opportunities that may be opening up for establishing new export-oriented industries that will be based on Australia's really quite tremendous advantage in renewable energy supply. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Frank. If I could just highlight a few takeaway messages from your presentation there. They were that there are reductions in the energy demand across the world, and a lot is happening in particular in the aviation fuel space, where there's been dramatic changes. And your prediction that maybe that things will return, maybe not so much to the aviation to 100%, but overall these reductions should go back going forward. So it'll be interesting to see whether people's behavior has fundamentally changed over this period or not. And then the notion that renewables should play a big role in the recovery period as we do transition back. Now, the point that you showed around the ANU consumption data was fascinating, how there were those slight peaks when people were actually on campus, but actually the base load for the campus maintained quite a large energy consumption. I think you had, or power consumption, it was average 10 megawatts or so as base load. So that is a challenge that needs to be resolved, how we deal with these large campus infrastructure when there's no one practically on there. So thank you very much, Frank, for your perspectives. Now, at this point, I'd just like to invite all the panelists back on video. And there are a few questions here, some of which have been answered, and I will read those out in a second. But let me start off with the first one here, which is from Abhilash Anil Kali to Nicola. When you said that the existing energy forecasting models have not really been useful, seeing the current pandemic and the unprecedented scenarios it has created, how has AEMO tackled this case? Were the models refined to get an upper hand? What factors were considered when the models were refined on such short notice?
Yeah, look, thanks. It is a great question. Look, we use a number of different forecasting models in AEMO, and we do it for a number of different forecasting purposes. So we have a very detailed operational forecasting model that can really use AI/ML techniques to take observations of the day and retrain the models for what might happen the next half hour or the next day and then the next week. And those ones we were able to retrain quite quickly on new data and compare it against what we would have used otherwise, and assume that the delta represents the impact that COVID is having. So those ones helped us then inform what might be the delta or change in COVID that we would expect in some of our longer term models that we could then put into those. The longer term models include some more of your economic type regressions and everything as well. So again, that was quite challenging because you could get a new economic forecast and you could put it into the model, but it's not necessarily going to be that the coefficients are still relevant and that the behaviours or the impacts from the economic outlook is going to be reflective of what we're seeing, particularly with the residential and commercial changes. So there did need to be a few overrides. What we did also is moved away from trying to predict a single demand future, even in the short term, and looked at sensitivities. So, what if after we return, there is an X% reduction in commercial loads? What if, there is a breakaway in terms of the, correlations that we've observed in the relationships in the past, and we're seeing more people working from home, and trying to really understand a range of uncertainty, because ultimately it's not actually demand for operational forecasting. We need accurate demand for the next, period for dispatch. For longer term stuff, we need to understand what we need to do to plan and where the risks might be from a reliability and security purpose. So it was a combination depending on model, and we certainly used what we could learn from the more detailed AI/ML type models of the operational forecast to inform the long term.
Okay, thanks very much, Nicola. I guess a related question here for Rob, being a serial forecaster and a statistician. This one's from Ryan Lee. How would you explain some of the more sophisticated forecasting techniques to someone who does not have a background in forecasting or statistics?
Yeah, great question. And sort of Nicola's covered part of this already, I guess. But there's a couple of different types of models get used. There's the short-term ones for operational forecasting, and then there's longer-term ones. And the main difference between them is what are the inputs to the model. So you can think about any of these forecasting models as having a whole lot of inputs, and then the output is the demand usually that you're trying to predict. And the inputs will be historical demand values. So if you're doing forecasting for 1 day ahead, it's the demand that you've got now and for the last week or so. It will have temperatures, not just current temperature, but temperatures going back over usually at least a week because of thermal inertia in buildings. And there'll be calendar effects. Is it a public holiday? Which day of the week it is? There'll be, for the longer term models, there's economic effects go in there, population and so on. So all of these inputs to the model, and then the output is the demand. There's a couple of flavors of the models. There's the machine learning type models, which are usually built on a neural network. So it's a sort of a model that mimics the way, it's supposed to mimic the way a human brain works. And they're the ones that are often used for operational demand. And then the longer term ones are usually built on GAMs, generalized additive models, which is a sort of a fancier version of regression. So if people have done a first or second year statistics class, they've normally done linear regression, and then the generalized additive models are sort of fancier versions of those with non-linearities and interactions built in. But whichever one it is, the machine learning one or the statistical GAMs, it's really just a whole lot of inputs and some complicated equations, and then you've got an output, which is your demand.
Thanks for that, Rob. Ryan, I hope that answers your question. One from Chloe Munro. This one's for Frank. Hi, Frank. Thank you for your comments. And hearing what the PM had said today regarding his conversation with Boyo, any thoughts on how modelling can be used more persuasively to convince government that the energy transition is an opportunity, not a threat to economic recovery?
Yeah, look, I don't know what the PM said today. It'd be great to hear more about that. But look, what modeling needs to do is to truly map out the possibility space, right? So we've got a long history, not just in Australia, but internationally, of modeling really underplaying the extent of change that we might see in energy systems, and in fact, the extent of change that we have seen, right? So, you know, take any kind of modeling scenario from 10 years ago, chances are that the most optimistic, bullish scenario on renewables is sort of not nearly as high on renewables as reality turned out to be, right? And so I think looking forward, as we commission or do modeling, we need to have a more open mind to the fact that things may well turn out differently in the future than we think now, right? Technology, economics, things that we didn't anticipate can happen, and we need to just open that up, right, and say it could turn out this way, and it could also turn out that way, and this way lie tremendous opportunities for Australia in a decarbonised world economy, right? And that's, you know, I mean, yeah, we've got a really nice new sort of research program at AEMO, below the Grand Challenge on renewable energy exports to the Asia Pacific, right? And, you know, therein lies some really big economic opportunities, and it's really all upside for Australia there.
Okay. Thank you, Frank. Now, considering the time, we did want to finish up about 5 minutes too. So to give the panelists just one final opportunity, I did want to ask them a on-the-spot question, which is, what is the big research challenge that emerges from this COVID-19 period that we should absolutely be working on? So let me start and keep the same order. So I will fire away to Nicola.
Yeah, thanks for putting us on the spot on that one. Look, I'm going to answer it slightly differently. I think for us, and this might surprise you all, but for us, it actually hit home how important it is to really understand different sectors and the consumption and behaviours and patterns of use in different sectors. So, you know, we actually had to very quickly make greater use of metadata analytics to try and understand how consumer behaviour is changing in response to COVID. And the next shock could be something different, right? So it's not necessarily preparing for another COVID, but really how do we get to a point where we've got great understanding of commercial, residential behaviours, how that changes with your uptake of PV, EV consumers and so forth, so that we can very quickly monitor. And it was quite interesting that at the beginning of lockdown, governments were coming to us to ask, as they would have with Rob and Frank and others, to ask whether we can use and track those changes in consumption that we're observing in real time to estimate just how effective the calls for working from home and those sorts of things have been. And that was something we didn't have at our fingertips, and we're all learning to do so now. So a research area is to how do we better use metadata to understand behavioural consumption changes.
Fascinating. Thank you. Rob?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really does change the nature of the types of models you want to use. So typically in forecasting, you train a model on a lot of historical data, and then you assume that the patterns you've seen in the past will continue into the future, so you can use the model for prediction. And that breaks when you've got a big structural effect like COVID-19. So then you have to think, well, what part of the model is still valid into the future, and what parts do I need to adjust or adapt, modify in some way to allow for the change in circumstances. And it really requires then, instead of a sort of a relatively dumb model, which just takes lots of data and generates outputs, you have to be a lot smarter about building that model to build in what you know about how the system works. And as Nicola said, that often means being more disaggregated, because when you're more disaggregated, you can use your knowledge of what's happening in the residential space or your knowledge of what's happening in the business space to adapt the model differently. So that's sort of the first thing, is trying to build a model that uses more of your knowledge of what's going on, rather than just rely on machine learning and AI to sort of fit and predict. The second thing is, I think there needs to be quite a lot of attention paid to how do you judgmentally adjust the forecasts, because sometimes you'll build a model that produces forecasts and you know the assumptions are wrong. So you have to adjust them. And as Nicola said, AEMO has been doing this, where they adjust the results based on what they know is going on. But to do that in a systematic and objective and reproducible way is quite difficult. And I think it would be great to see some more research in that space.
Thanks very much, Rob. And over to you, Frank.
Yeah, to me, the research challenge very much relates to the fact that that more people are working from home. And there were a few comments on the chat as well that pointing that out. And so, yeah, that's what we've got. And, in all likelihood, we will retain at least some of that, which has many, many benefits, right? But it seems to me like from the data that we have up to date is that overall, right, we still keep running the large venues, the large office towers, the, whatever it is, where we have much lower density of people either working there or going there for pleasure, right? And so we're not really seem to be making use of the energy saving opportunities that come from a share of the population at work working from home. And so that to me seems like an untapped opportunity where clearly research is needed, because we just really didn't anticipate that anything like that might happen so swiftly. And so, that I think there's a PhD thesis or two in that.
Fantastic. Well, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our three panelists here, Nicola, Rob, and Frank. It's been wonderful to hear your perspectives on what is a very challenging and important, a problem that we're facing, but something that I think you've all highlighted we can really learn from and actually transition into an energy system that's going to be better, maybe more reliable on, or maybe featuring more solar cells as clearly indicated, and reliant on renewables, but clearly understanding and questioning the security and reliability issues that presents, and also the changes in behavior that will undoubtedly emerge. I think these are big challenges that you have all addressed. So on that note, thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank the audience members here today. We had over 190 people join us, which is a fantastic success for an inaugural webinar series. So again, to you all, thank you very much for making the time. Now, before finishing up today, I would like to just mention that this is a webinar series that we hope to run continuously in the future. We actually have our next planned webinar on the 11th of December at 10 a.m. That will be hosted by Associate Professor Bruce Mountain from Victoria University. The webinar will be focused on the economics of electricity storage with speakers from Victoria University, the University of Melbourne and CSIRO. Now the webinar series will also continue on next year, and that's in the planning phase. So on that note, I'd just like to thank all the audience members and the panelists here for your attendance. And on behalf of the ERICA members, thank you and have a good day. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.